He drove the same route for 12 years. Never late, never complained. The passengers called him quiet driver. But when the police officer checked his license and saw the old address, everything changed. He stepped back, saluted, and whispered 5 words that made the entire bus go silent. "Welcome to the Human Stories." Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in silence. The Route 47 bus pulled away from Central Station at exactly 6:15 a.m., just like it had every weekday for the past 12 years. Behind the wheel sat a man the passengers simply called Frank. No last name, no personal details, just Frank, the quiet driver who never missed a day, never raised his voice, and somehow always kept the old blue bus running smooth despite its age. Frank wore the same uniform every day, navy blue shirt, black slacks, and a cap that covered most of his graying hair. His hands, weathered but steady, gripped the steering wheel with the kind of precision that came from years of routine. He knew every pothole, every traffic light, every passenger who climbed aboard at their regular stops. The morning commuters had their patterns too. Mrs. Chen always sat in the third row, clutching her purse and reading the same newspaper. The college students claimed the back seats, earbuds in, worlds away. Business people stood near the front, checking phones and watches, always in a hurry to get somewhere more important, but none of them really noticed Frank. He was just part of the scenery, like the faded advertisements on the bus walls or the worn fabric seats that had seen better days. They dropped their coins in the fare box, mumbled their good mornings, and forgot he existed until they needed to get off. Frank preferred it that way. He had learned long ago that being invisible was a kind of protection. No questions meant no answers. No curiosity meant no complications. Just the route, the passengers, and the quiet hum of the diesel engine that had become the soundtrack to his carefully constructed ordinary life. The bus made its first stop at Elm Street. 3 regulars climbed aboard: a nurse heading to the hospital, a maintenance worker carrying his toolbox, and an elderly man who always nodded respectfully at Frank. They took their usual seats without conversation, settling into the comfortable rhythm of another Tuesday morning. As the bus pulled back into traffic, Frank caught a glimpse of something in his side mirror that made his jaw tighten slightly. A police car, 2 blocks back, following the same route. Probably nothing, he told himself. Random patrol. But his hands shifted on the wheel, and his eyes began checking the mirrors more frequently. The officer behind the wheel was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of eager alertness that came with wanting to prove yourself. Officer Martinez had been on the force for 3 years, and traffic stops were still opportunities to do good police work. He'd noticed the bus because it was driving exactly the speed limit, not 5 over like most vehicles, not 5 under like someone trying too hard to avoid attention. Exactly the limit. That kind of precision caught his attention.
Forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support keeps these stories alive.
When the bus stopped at the next intersection, Martinez made his decision. He flipped on his lights, not aggressively, just enough to signal the driver to pull over. Probably just a routine check: registration, insurance, maybe a friendly reminder about the bus's exhaust system that seemed to be running a little rough. Frank saw the lights in his mirror and felt something cold settle in his stomach. 12 years of routine, 12 years of invisibility, and now this. He pulled the bus to the curb carefully, applied the parking brake, and turned to face his passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a brief delay," he announced, his voice calm and steady. "Police need to check our paperwork." "Nothing to worry about." The passengers stirred with mild irritation. Mrs. Chen looked up from her paper. The college students pulled out their earbuds. The business people checked their watches and sighed. Just another inconvenience in their day. Officer Martinez approached the bus door, noting how the driver had positioned the vehicle perfectly parallel to the curb, hazard lights blinking in regulation sequence. Professional. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Martinez climbed the steps. "Morning," he said, removing his sunglasses. "Routine check. Can I see your commercial license, registration, and insurance?" Frank nodded once and reached for his wallet. His movements were deliberate, controlled, hands visible at all times, no sudden motions. He handed over the documents without a word. Martinez glanced at the registration first. Vehicle was properly licensed, insurance current. Then he looked at the commercial driver's license, scanning the basic information. Frank Morrison, age 58, address on Pine Street. Clean record, no violations, no restrictions, but it was the license renewal history that caught his eye. The address changes told a story of someone who had moved frequently in earlier years. Chicago, 1985. San Diego, 1986. And then, in 1987, an address that made Martinez pause, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Building 3425, Barracks Complex C. Martinez had grown up in a military family. His grandfather had been stationed at Bragg. He knew that address. That wasn't just any barracks. That was where they housed the special operations personnel. The ones who didn't officially exist on most rosters. He looked up at Frank, really looked at him for the first time. The posture, the way he held his hands, the controlled breathing. The haircut that was civilian now but still carried the shadow of military precision. The eyes that weren't just watching, they were scanning, assessing, calculating. "Sir," Martinez said quietly, "could you step outside for a moment?" Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the passengers, who were now paying attention, sensing something had shifted. Mrs. Chen's newspaper was forgotten. The college students were filming with their phones. The business people were craning their necks to see what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Frank asked, his voice still steady. "No problem, sir. Just need to verify some information." Frank stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. He walked down the aisle of the bus, feeling the eyes of every passenger on him. At the door, he paused and looked back. "This won't take long," he told them. "Please remain in your seats." Outside, the morning air was crisp. Traffic continued to flow around them, but Martinez had positioned himself so that he and Frank were partially shielded from view by the bus. He held the license in his hand, studying it again. "Fort Bragg," Martinez said quietly. 1987, that's a very specific address. Frank said nothing, but his shoulders squared slightly. An unconscious response to authority that he'd never quite shaken. "My grandfather served there," Martinez continued. "He told me stories about the men who lived in that particular complex. Said they were different from regular soldiers. Quieter. Disappeared for months at a time. Came back changed." Still Frank remained silent, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen too much, met the young officer's gaze directly. He said they were the ones who did the jobs nobody else could do. The ones who went places that didn't exist on maps. The ones who came home with stories they'd never tell. Martinez looked down at the license again, then back at Frank. He also said they were the best men he'd ever served with. Heroes, every one of them. Frank's throat worked once, swallowing hard. "Officer, I don't know what your 1987, Martinez interrupted gently. That was the year of Operation Urgent Fury. Grenada. My grandfather was there. He told me about a team that went in ahead of the main force. Reconnaissance. Deep penetration. Saved a lot of lives by doing the impossible." Frank's hands, which had been steady on the steering wheel for 12 years, began to tremble slightly. He said the team leader was someone special. Someone who brought all his men home when everyone said it couldn't be done. Someone who earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart and then disappeared into civilian life because he'd given enough. The silence stretched between them. Around them, the city continued its morning rhythm, cars passing, people walking to work, life moving forward. But in that small space beside the bus, time seemed suspended. Martinez stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Frank could hear. He said the team leader's name was Morrison. Sergeant First Class Frank Morrison. And he said if he ever met that man, he'd want to shake his hand and say thank you. Frank's composure finally cracked. His eyes, which had remained steady through 12 years of routine and anonymity, filled with something that might have been relief or pain or both. "I'm nobody special," Frank whispered. "Just a bus driver." Martinez straightened to attention. Not the casual attention of a traffic cop, but the sharp, precise attention of a soldier recognizing a superior. Then he did something that made every passenger on the bus lean forward in their seats. He saluted, sharp, clean, respectful. The salute a young soldier gives to a man who has earned every honor the military can bestow. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Morrison," Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "Thank you for bringing them home." Frank stared at the young officer, his carefully constructed walls crumbling. For 12 years, he had been just Frank the bus driver. No questions, no recognition, no reminders of who he used to be. But now, standing on a street corner in the morning light, he was Frank Morrison again. The man who had gone into the jungle when others wouldn't. The man who had made impossible decisions and lived with the consequences. "You don't understand," Frank said, his voice barely audible. "I lost 2 men. 2 good men who trusted me to bring them home. I failed them." Martinez lowered his salute but didn't step back. "My grandfather told me something else about that mission. He said the team leader carried his wounded men 8 miles through enemy territory. Alone. With a bullet in his leg and shrapnel in his shoulder. He said that man saved 4 lives at the cost of 2, and that's not failure, that's heroism." Frank's hands were shaking now, 12 years of suppressed emotion finally finding a crack in his armor. Their names were Davis and Chen. "I see their faces every day. And they see yours," Martinez said softly. "And they know you never stopped carrying them." The bus behind them was completely silent now. Passengers pressed against windows, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Mrs. Chen, whose name Frank had never known was the same as one of his fallen soldiers, had tears streaming down her face. The college students had stopped filming, sensing something sacred was happening. The business people had forgotten about being late. Martinez handed the license back to Frank. "Your paperwork's in order, sir. You're free to go." But Frank didn't move. He stood there, holding the license, looking at the young officer who had somehow seen through 12 years of careful invisibility. "How?" Frank asked. "How did you know?" Martinez smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Because men like you never really disappear. You just drive buses and teach school and work night shifts and try to blend in. But you can't hide what you are. Not from someone who knows what to look for." Frank nodded slowly, understanding something he hadn't realized before. He wasn't invisible because he was trying to hide. He was invisible because people chose not to see. But this young officer had chosen to look deeper, to see the man behind the uniform, the hero behind the ordinary facade. "Will you tell them?" Frank asked, gesturing toward the bus. Martinez considered this. "That's not my story to tell, sir. That's yours. But I will say this, they've been riding with a hero for 12 years. They just didn't know it." Frank walked back to the bus slowly, his steps somehow different now. He climbed the steps and settled into his driver's seat, but before he could speak, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen stood up. "Thank you," she said simply. "Whatever you did, wherever you served, thank you." Then the maintenance worker stood. "Yeah, thank you." One by one, the passengers rose from their seats. The college students, the business people, the elderly man who always nodded, all of them standing in quiet respect for a man they had never really seen before. Frank looked at them through the rearview mirror, these people who had been part of his daily routine for 12 years. They were still the same passengers, but something had changed. They were seeing him now. Really seeing him. "I was just doing my job," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "No," said Mrs. Chen. "You were doing something more than that. You were serving. And you never stopped." Frank started the engine, the familiar diesel rumble filling the quiet space. But as he pulled back into traffic, he caught sight of Officer Martinez in his side mirror. The young officer was still standing at attention, saluting, Until the bus was completely out of sight, the rest of the route passed in a different kind of silence. Not the anonymous quiet of strangers sharing space, but the respectful quiet of people who had witnessed something important. When passengers got off at their stops, they thanked Frank. Not just for the ride, but for something bigger, something they couldn't quite name but felt in their hearts. That evening, Frank sat in his small apartment, still wearing his uniform. On the table beside him was a wooden box he hadn't opened in 12 years. Inside were the medals and commendations he had earned in another life, in another world. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the Combat Infantryman badged, he had hidden them away because looking at them hurt too much. They reminded him of Davis and Chen, of the men who hadn't come home, of the weight he carried every day. But tonight, for the first time in 12 years, he opened the box. The medals caught the light from his table lamp, gleaming like they had on the day they were pinned to his chest. But Frank wasn't looking at the medals. He was looking at the photograph tucked beneath them, a faded picture of 6 men in camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the jungle heat and the danger that surrounded them. 4 of those men had come home. 2 had not. And for 12 years, Frank had thought that made him a failure, but a young police officer had shown him something different today. He had shown him that carrying his men home, even when it meant carrying their memory, was not failure. It was service. It was honor. It was the reason he woke up every morning and drove the same route, taking care of people who needed to get where they were going. Frank Morrison, the quiet bus driver, had never stopped being Sergeant First Class Frank Morrison. He had just found a different way to serve. The next morning, he arrived at the bus depot at his usual time. But when he climbed behind the wheel of Route 47, he sat a little straighter. When passengers boarded, he looked them in the eye and meant it when he said good morning. And when Mrs. Chen took her usual seat in the 3rd row, she smiled at him and said, "Thank you for the ride, Sergeant." Frank smiled back, feeling something he hadn't felt in 12 years. Not the weight of what he'd lost, but the pride in what he'd carried. He was still the quiet driver. But now he was something more. He was a hero who had never stopped serving. The bus pulled away from Central Station at exactly 6:15 a.m., just like it had every weekday for the past 12 years. But today was different. Today, the passengers knew they were riding with someone special. Someone who had given everything for his country and then given 12 more years of quiet service to his community. And in the driver's seat, Frank Morrison, bus driver, veteran, hero, drove his route with the knowledge that some stories are worth telling, even when they're told in the silence between stops. The route continued, but the legend had begun. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone like Frank? Someone whose quiet service hid a deeper story of sacrifice and honor? Someone who served in silence, asking for nothing but giving everything? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the heroes hiding in plain sight in your community. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that every act of service deserves recognition, especially when the person serving doesn't ask for it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others. Help us honor those who serve in silence, who carry their burdens with dignity, and who remind us that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear the simple clothes of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, look closer at the people around you. You might be surprised by the heroes you find.